Tonight is a very special occasion as we are excited to hear a discussion on the relationship between science and religion. With us tonight are four prominent scholars from diverse philosophical backgrounds here to discuss this topic. First, I would like to give a brief introduction of the scholars with us tonight. We have the pleasure of hearing again from Dr. Alvin Plantinga. Many of us here had the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Plantinga's discussion last night on atheism versus evolution. Dr. Plantinga received his MA in philosophy from the University of Michigan and his PhD in philosophy from Yale University. Dr. Plantinga's wide-ranging philosophical interests and important contributions figure perhaps most prominently in metaphysics and epistemology, specifically as related to philosophy of religion. He is currently the John A. O'Brien Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. We also have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Richard Gale. Dr. Gale received his MA and PhD in philosophy from New York University. Dr. Gale's main philosophical interests and chief contributions are in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and pragmatism. He is presently the adjunct professor of philosophy at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Also, we are honored to have with us Dr. Quentin Smith. Dr. Smith received his MA and PhD in philosophy from Boston College, and his primary areas of interest are metaphysics, philosophy of religion and naturalism, philosophy of time, ethics, and philosophy of science. He's presently a professor of philosophy and University Distinguished Faculty Scholar at the University of Western Michigan. Finally, we are honored to have with us Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig holds 2 doctorates, one in philosophy from the University of Birmingham, England, and one in systematic theology from the University of Munich, Germany. Dr. Craig's areas of particular interest and expertise include philosophy of religion, the historicity of Jesus Christ's resurrection, and the philosophy of time. He is currently research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology. I would like also to introduce for tonight's moderator, Mr. Keith Abney. Mr. Abney received multiple degrees also, including an MA in History and Philosophy of Science from the University of Notre Dame, an MA in Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, and an MA in Philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Here at Cal Poly, Mr. Abney teaches many classes, including Philosophy of Science, Philosophy Classics, and Ethics. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Abney, who will further explain the format of tonight's event. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. I see there are quite a few of you. We're going to begin tonight with a few remarks by me. I'll start with some preliminary remarks about how this is going to work. We're going to have, after I finish my remarks, 4 opening statements, each with a response. Each of our 4 panelists will get a 10-minute shot at articulating their view about the relationship of science and religion. Again, one of the other panelists will then give a 5-minute response after each presentation. At the end of that time, we will then begin a free dialogue amongst the panelists. I'll be moderating that. That should last about 20 minutes. I'll try to keep them from throwing things at each other.
Thank you very much. During the last quarter century, a flourishing dialogue between science and religion has been going on in North America and Europe. Science and religion have discovered that they have important mutual interests and contributions to make to each other. Let me list just 4 ways in which science and religion are related. First, religion furnishes the conceptual framework in which science can flourish. Science is not something that is natural to mankind. As Lauren Isley has emphasized, science is an invented cultural institution which requires a unique soil in which to flourish. Modern science did not arise in the Orient or in Africa, but in Western civilization. Why is this so? Isley argues that it is due to the unique contribution of the Christian faith to Western culture. The scientific enterprise is based on certain assumptions which cannot be proved scientifically, but which are guaranteed by the Christian worldview. For example, the laws of logic, the orderly nature of the external world, the reliability of our cognitive faculties, and the objectivity of the moral values used in science. Science couldn't even exist without these assumptions, and yet these assumptions cannot be proved scientifically. They are philosophical assumptions, which, interestingly, are part and parcel of a Christian worldview. Thus, religion is relevant to science in that it can furnish a conceptual framework in which science can exist. More than that, the Christian religion historically did furnish the conceptual framework in which modern science was born and nurtured. Secondly, science can both verify and falsify the claims of religion. When religions make claims about the natural world, they intersect the domain of science and are, in effect, making predictions which scientific investigation can either verify or falsify. Let me give some examples of each. First, examples of falsifications. Some examples are obvious. The views of ancient Greek and Indian religions that the heavens or the world rested upon the shoulders of Atlas or on the back of a great turtle were easily falsified. But more subtle examples are available too. One of the most notorious was the medieval church's condemnation of Galileo for holding that the earth moves around the sun rather than vice versa. On their basis of misinterpretation of certain biblical passages, medieval theologians denied that the earth moved. But scientific evidence falsified this hypothesis, and the church belatedly finally came to admit its mistake. Another interesting example of science's falsifying a religious view is the claim of many Eastern religions, like Hinduism and Taoism, that the world is divine and therefore eternal. The discovery during the 20th century of the expansion of the universe reveals that far from being eternal, all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into existence at a finite point before which nothing existed. As Stephen Hawking says in his book, The Nature of Space and Time, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. But if the universe came into being at the Big Bang, then it is temporally finite and contingent in its existence, and therefore neither eternal nor divine, as pantheistic religions had claimed. On the other hand, science can also verify religious claims. For example, one of the principal doctrines of the Judeo-Christian faith is that God created the universe out of nothing a finite time ago. The Bible begins with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The Bible thus teaches that the universe had a beginning. This teaching was repudiated both by ancient Greek philosophy and by modern atheism. Then in 1929, with the discovery of the expansion of the universe, this doctrine was dramatically verified. Physicists John Barrow and Frank Tipler, speaking of the beginning of the universe, explain, "At this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity. So if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation out of nothing." Against all expectation, science thus verified this religious prediction. A second scientific verification of a religious belief is the claim of the great monotheistic faiths that the world is the product of intelligent design. Scientists originally thought that whatever the initial conditions of the universe were, eventually the universe would evolve the life forms that we see today. But during the last 30 years or so, scientists have been stunned by the discovery of how complex and sensitive a balance of initial conditions must be given in the Big Bang in order for the universe to permit the evolution and existence of intelligent life. In various fields, discoveries have repeatedly disclosed that the existence of intelligent life depends upon an incomprehensibly delicate balance of physical constants and quantities, such that if any of these were altered even by a hair's breadth, the balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. In fact, the universe appears to have been fine-tuned from the moment of its inception for the production of intelligent life. Given the incomprehensible improbability of the initial conditions necessary for our existence, it is plausible to believe that these are not the result of chance, but of design. Thus, science can both verify and falsify claims of religion. Third, science encounters metaphysical problems, which religion can help to solve. A possible example is the so-called measurement problem in quantum physics. According to quantum physics, subatomic particles do not have all of their properties intrinsically, but only in relation to a measuring apparatus. The problem is that the measuring apparatus itself can also be described by quantum physics, but then it too lacks certain properties unless it is related to another measuring apparatus. But that apparatus can also be described by quantum physics, and off we go on a vicious infinite regress. Unless there is some way to break the chain, nothing would possess any of these properties, which is absurd. Now, some physicists have proposed that the chain is broken when the measurement is observed by consciousness. But it seems outrageous to say that the whole universe depends upon human consciousness for its existence. Moreover, human consciousness is linked to a physical substratum, the brain, which can be given a quantum physical description. So the question inevitably arises, who observes the human observers? What is needed here is a sort of transcendent, cosmic observer who observes immediately the result of any quantum measurement situation. But this is, of course, exactly the being in whom the theist believes. And thus, the person who believes in God seems to have the resources needed to resolve the measurement problem plaguing quantum physics. Finally, number 4, religion can help to adjudicate scientific theories. In cases in which two scientific theories are empirically equivalent, metaphysical concerns, including religious concerns, come into play. An excellent example is the special theory of relativity. There are two ways to interpret the mathematics of special relativity. On Einstein's interpretation, there is no absolute now in the world. Rather, what is now is relative to different observers in motion. But on Lorentz's interpretation, there is an absolute now in the world, but we just can't be sure which events in the world are happening now because motion affects our measuring instruments. These two interpretations are empirically equivalent. But I want to argue that if God exists, then Lorentz was right. And here's the argument. If God exists, then God is in time because he is really related to the world. But if God is in time, then a privileged observer exists. And if a privileged observer exists, then an absolute now exists. Thus, there is an absolute now, just as Lorentz claimed. So if God exists, a Lorentzian rather than an Einsteinian theory of relativity is correct. It's hard to imagine how religion could have any greater relevance to science than this, to show that one theory is wrong and another is right. So in summary then, I've described four ways in which science and religion can relate. Religion can furnish the conceptual framework in which science can flourish. Science can both verify and falsify claims of religion. Science encounters metaphysical problems which religion can help to solve. And religion can adjudicate scientific theories. And that's why, after all, the dialogue between these two disciplines is flourishing today.
Let's look at the different reasons that William Craig advanced for thinking that science somehow is an aid, or it's aided by religion. First, he says that religion furnishes the conceptual framework in which science can flourish. That science, in order to get started, has to assume that the universe is orderly, that logic will work, and that our minds are cognitively in tune with the universe. Now, I don't think science has to assume that these things are true in order to get started. It could simply adopt as a working hypothesis that there are causal laws to be discovered and the universe is orderly. Moreover, it has quite a bit of good empirical evidence from our common sense experiences that there is widespread regularity in the world. Furthermore, it's possible that religion would give rise to science and that science would wind up giving a view of the world that would challenge the religious view. And that's going to be the substance of my 10-minute remarks, so I won't go into it here. It's something like Bertrand Russell's remark, common sense gives rise to science, but science, if true, refutes common sense, because it depicts a world that challenges the common sense view of things as having, objective sensory qualities. Let's move on now. I think it's completely gratuitous for Craig to say that the Big Bang Theory shows that there's a creation ex nihilo. All it shows is that there's some point in the past beyond which we cannot extrapolate. So it's unknowable to us. But there's nothing in the expanding universe theory that would support a doctrine of creation ex nihilo. That's simply something that has been added on to a scientific theory. I won't comment on the measurement problem in quantum mechanics because I don't have sufficient technical knowledge. I'll leave it to you, Quentin, to do it. I'm not up to the task. So, where if one is ignorant, thereof one should be silent. Now, the claim is that religion can help to adjudicate rival claims in science, like the opposition between a Lorentzian and Einsteinian version of relativity theory. I don't think any scientist would think that appeal to a temporal God who endures in time in any way would help to solve the issue in favor of the Lorentzian view. The reason is it's not in principle determinable by empirical means what this objective now is. And science wants to not allow its ontology, what it takes to be real, to outstrip what in principle is verifiable. So it might settle the matter from the standpoint of a theologian, but certainly not someone committed to the scientific method of inquiry. Well, these are just a few quick remarks, and
Quentin Smith is next.
That's only the first.
think quickly about the fine-tuning argument about the four natural constants. We know human life, complex forms, has evolved. And to do so, you need just the right fine-tuning of the universe. And supposedly that requires an intelligent designer. But isn't that rather conceited on our part, to think there's something so wonderful about us, that would be the purpose of creation? Whatever evolves is highly improbable. It's like whoever wins the lottery, it was highly improbable they would win. And you could say, in order for this to evolve, this highly improbable state of affairs, you had to have this proper combination of the right instantial conditions and laws and so on. So I don't see why the fact that this human life, and it requires fine-tuning, should be any evidence for the existence of an intelligent designer.
Can you hear me from right here? Okay. All the theists I know, they would say that if they had to make a choice between saying that all of science is false or theism is false, they would say that theism is false. And what I want to argue today is that there is a contemporary scientific theory that is highly confirmed, and that if true, entails that God does not exist, and therefore that atheism is true. Now that theory is Einstein's general theory of relativity as applied to the universe in Big Bang cosmology. Now, in this universe, I've drawn here the first 3 minutes of the universe. This is the first minute. This may be called the Big Bang. This is the first minute, the second minute, and third minute. And as you can see, the first minute causes the second minute, it sufficiently causes it, and the second minute sufficiently causes the third minute, and that the fourth minute. So what that means is that the universe, each state of the universe is sufficiently causally explained by prior states of the universe. And then if that's the case, then there's no room or place or possibility for there to be a supernatural being, such as God, to cause the universe, since the universe has already caused itself in the metaphorical sense that each part of the universe is caused by another part. And if that's true, there's nothing left for God to cause. And one might say that, well, if each part of the universe is caused by another part, then what about the whole of all the parts? Isn't that something that God could cause? And I think the answer to that would be no, because a whole is wholly identical with all the parts. And so all the parts entail the existence of the whole. Now this is true whether the whole be a set or a mere logical sum or an aggregate or whatever type of whole you want to conceive. And so if there are two things that are logically equivalent, the whole of the universe and all the parts of the universe, and one is explained, then that means the other one is also explained. So if each part of the universe is causally explained by another part, and all the parts of the universe are logically equivalent to the whole that's wholly identical with all the parts, that implies the whole of the universe is caused. So therefore, God can't cause any of the parts, God can't cause the whole, so God can't cause anything. And on Einstein's theory, the universe is completely self-caused. Now, this is even true if the universe began 15 billion years ago in a Big Bang. Because what happened here, there was no first state of the universe that is uncaused by something natural or physical, and that would need God to cause it. Because if you take the first minute, okay, the third minute is divided into two halves. It's half a minute, half a minute, half a minute, half a minute. And this is half a minute, half a minute, half a minute. And this whole minute causes this whole minute. Now this is the first minute. Now here we have half the minute. Then I'm dividing up the other half of the minute into actually I shouldn't have 1/4 here. I should have 1/2 here. I should have 1/4. 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, and so on. And you can do that in real numbers as well, which is how Einstein's general theory of relativity works, because its mathematics uses real numbers, just as did Newton's and just as do the spatial temporal variables of quantum mechanics, even though the energy and momentum variables don't range over a continuum of points. And so if we take this way of dividing up the universe into the beginning, we have a half a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second, and we keep on going through all the real numbers. And what happens is we never reach a first state. And the reason why is that the first instant of the first minute is physically impossible according to Einstein's general theory of relativity. And it's physically impossible because every quantity of the universe would be some number divided by 0, and division by 0 is impermissible in mathematics. So, for example, the temperature of the first state would be some number n over 0, so that's impossible. And the density of the first state, if there was one, would be some density number n over 0, which is impossible. And the curvature of the first state would be n over 0 as well. So it's impossible that there would be a first state of the universe, which means that the first minute is half open, which means that instead of there being a first instant, for every instant there is an earlier instant. And even though that doesn't mean time is infinitely past in that direction, it goes on for a number of minutes or hours, it begins right here at this first minute. And the sense in which each temporal instantaneous slice is caused is that as you continue to divide up these slices towards, or you want to number them by the real numbers, you're never going to get to a first instantaneous state or slice of the universe that would count as the first instant of the universe. So you would get, for every state, it'd be caused by some other state. Now that follows from the mathematics of real numbers, and that's used in Einstein's general theory of relativity. And that implies that between any two real numbers, there is another real number. And so if we delete the first instant, then that means we're deleting a real number. And so what is there between that state with its real number that that's related to some other state? Well, there can't be a second state, because if we delete the first state, if there were a second state, then that would be the first state. Because for real numbers, after every state, there is another state. So for any state we point to, there's going to be another state in between it. So if we delete this first state of the universe and want to say that this is the second state, so this is now the second state and can be caused by God, that would be false, because between any two instantaneous states, there would be another state. And this state would cause that state. And if we're going to delete this, we want to say, well, if we delete this, then there's this state that's going to be the first state and can be caused by God. That would be false too, because between this and this, there's another state. And you keep dividing up by halves infinitely, and you never ever get to a first state because you've already deleted the first state from the first minute. It's like, in terms of hours, like taking 12 noon to 1 o'clock. It's like deleting the instant 12 noon. Well, there's no instant that comes immediately after 12 noon. Any instant you point to, there's going to be other instance prior to it. And the same with the beginning of the universe. And so what that shows is even if the universe begins, each part of the universe is caused by earlier parts. So it doesn't matter if the universe is infinitely old or not. Even if the universe begins, there's no place for God to create the first state because there is no first state. And so what we have here is a universe that explains its own existence in the metaphorical sense that each part of the universe is caused by an earlier part, and B, all the parts of the universe are logically equivalent to the whole of the universe. And if all the parts are causally explained, then it logically follows that the whole is explained, because the whole would then be a logical entailment of all the parts. So there's nothing whatsoever left for God to explain. No parts, no whole. And since this is the currently accepted theory, Big Bang cosmology, which is a solution to Einstein's equation, general theory of relativity, then it follows that the universe is completely naturally caused by its parts, and there's absolutely no room for a God to cause anything, and therefore God does not exist.
Let me say, before I look at Quentin's argument specifically, two things about it. First, I don't think it's an argument against the existence of God, per se. It's an argument against creation. It's an argument against creation out of nothing, but it's not an argument against God's existence as such. And secondly, it's not really an argument based on the incompatibility of theism with the truth of science, but it's an argument based on the supposed incompatibility of theism with scientific realism about certain theories, particularly scientific realism about the general theory of relativity. Well, I don't think the theists need be committed at all to scientific realism about certain space-time theories. After all, the general theory is incompatible with quantum theory as well, not only with theism, if Quentin is right. So that one needn't be a realist about these theories in order to regard them as correct and accurate and making correct predictions. So the argument is really that creation is incompatible with scientific realism. I don't think the argument, even if correct, therefore, is quite so earth-shattering as it might seem at first. But is the argument correct? Well, the argument is that for every instant of time, there is always a prior instant, even if time is finite, and therefore there can be no cause of the universe. Now, the key premise in the argument seems to be that if every instantaneous state of the universe has a cause, then the universe has no cause. If every instantaneous state of the universe has a cause, then the universe as such has no cause. Now, notice, first of all, that that is a philosophical, not a scientific premise. That premise is nowhere in the general theory of relativity. So this doesn't demonstrate the incompatibility of that scientific theory with creation. Rather, this is a philosophical argument that uses scientific information to try to disqualify creation. But it is a philosophical, not a scientific argument. Now, is this premise true? Well, it seems to me that it's false to say that just because every instantaneous state of the universe has a cause, the universe can have no cause. What is the justification for that premise? Well, it's not altogether clear from Quentin's presentation. Perhaps he thinks that if every state of the universe is explained, then the whole universe is explained. But that is clearly a fallacy of composition. It's like reasoning because every part of an elephant is light in weight, therefore the whole elephant is light in weight. So that can't be the justification for the premise. Well, maybe Quentin means if A explains B and B entails C, then A explains C. But again, that doesn't seem to be true. I don't think explanation is closed under entailment in that way. To give an example, I could say that the lady from housekeeping making my bed explains why my bed was made. the fact that my bed was made entails that my bed exists. But does therefore the ladies from housekeeping making my bed explain the existence of the bed? Well, clearly not. So that won't work as a justification for this premise. And then consider the argument for the fact that the universe would have a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Quentin's argument implies that the universe never began to exist because it had no cause. If whatever begins to exist has a cause, then the universe, being uncaused, never began to exist. But in what sense did it never begin to exist? Well, Quentin would say the universe never began to exist because for every state of the universe, there is always another instantaneous prior state. But I think that's just the wrong definition of what it means to begin to exist. To begin to exist does not mean to have a beginning point of existence. It simply means that for any temporal interval at which something exists, there is only a finite number of equal intervals prior to that. And it's in that sense that we can say that the universe began to exist. And therefore, Quentin's premise, I think, is unjustified. Finally, notice one odd anomaly about this argument. If it's correct, then nothing could ever begin to move from a state of rest. Because if something is at rest and begins to move, there is no first instant at which it's moving. If it's moving, then it's already in motion. It's not beginning to move. But if it's at rest, then it hasn't yet begun to move. So if for something to begin to move from a state of rest implies there is no first instant at which it begins to move. Rather, it just begins to move, and you can always analyze its motion in terms of these instantaneous states right back to the point of rest. In exactly the same way, the universe could begin to exist even if it lacks an initial instant or beginning point of existence.
Now, Keith runs a really tight ship here, so I'm going to have to watch myself that I don't exceed my I guess I've got 10 minutes. Well, our topic is the relation between religion and science. Now, there are very many different kinds of religion, as you know. There is Buddhism, there is Christianity, there is Taoism, there is Hinduism, and so on, Judaism, Islam. There is also a kind of religion, there's something at least like a religion, as I said last night, something I'll call naturalism. That's the idea that there isn't any such person as God or anything like God. And I say naturalism, while maybe we can't say explicitly that it's religion, that might be stretching the term a bit, but I don't care to argue about these words. Naturalism, at any rate, performs many of the functions of a religion. I want to argue two theses in my 10 minutes. First, that there is superficial conflict but deep concord between Christianity and science. And I want to argue, second, that there is superficial concord but deep conflict between naturalism and science. So I say there is a religion-science conflict. It's between naturalism and science, not between Christianity and science. So first of all, the superficial conflict between Christianity and science. Let's take Christianity to be defined by the great creeds of the church, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Westminster Confession, add in some more if you want, and take what's common to them all, call that Christianity. Then clearly there's no conflict between Christianity and, say, physics. At least I don't see any. Clearly there's no conflict between Christianity and chemistry. You might say, well, maybe there's a conflict between Christianity and biology. But if that were so, it would presumably be because there is a conflict between Christian belief and evolution. Now, evolution has lots of different sides to it, and because Quentin will be breathing down my neck, I won't be able to explain any. I'm sorry, not Quentin. Keith will be breathing down my neck. I won't be able to explain any of that. But I'll just assert there isn't any incompatibility between Christian belief and evolution either. God could have created the world by virtue of evolutionary processes. Where there does seem to me to be a conflict is between Christian belief and a certain fast-growing part of psychology called evolutionary psychology, formerly called sociobiology. The whole aim of evolutionary psychology is to explain prominent, important human traits in terms of our evolutionary origin back there on the plains of Serengeti a million years ago. So evolutionary psychology attempts to explain, for example, the sort of behaviors that characterize men and women when they behave with respect to each other, parents and children too. But not only that, it also tries to explain such things as our love of art, our love of music, our love of stories, literature, and the like, and our religion and our morality. Attempts to explain all of these things in terms, as I say, of our evolutionary origin. Each of these things, whatever part of it we're talking about, at some point arose in some fashion and turned out to have adaptive value, enabled those people that displayed this trait or those groups that displayed this trait to survive and reproduce. So it was maintained in the race. All right. Now, some of these theories. One question is whether evolutionary psychology constitutes good science or not. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And I won't say anything about that one way or the other. I'll just assume for the moment that it does. And some of the theories from evolutionary psychology, I take it, are incompatible with Christian belief. For example, David Sloan Wilson's theory of the nature of religion is incompatible with Christian belief because it implies that the cognitive faculties or the sources of belief, the cognitive faculties that produce religious belief are not aimed at the truth. Rather, they're aimed at the production of behavior which is fitness maximizing. And that seems to me to be incompatible with Christian belief. So there is a conflict. Well, I say this conflict is superficial. Why do I say it's superficial? For the following reason. As all of you know, when you do science, you aren't supposed to use God in your theories or any other supernatural being. You can't explain something in science by proposing that God does it. Maybe Newton could get away with that. In the old days, he could say God periodically adjusts the orbits of the planets, but nowadays, that's not proper. That's not part of science. Nor can you use in science anything as evidence that you think you know or know by way of faith from the Bible, by way of revelation, or by way of faith from the Bible, for example. Can't do that. This sort of constraint on science is often called methodological naturalism. All right? Well, now suppose what we've got here in evolutionary psychology is a kind of science which, like with all science, is constrained by methodological naturalism. What does this mean? Well, what that means is that the scientific evidence base, what you can use as evidence in science or qua scientist, is constrained by methodological naturalism. It can't contain anything you know, for example, from revelation. But the Christian's evidential base is broader than that. It includes all that's in the evidential base of science, and in addition, it contains whatever the Christian knows by way of revelation, that there is such a person as God, that God is a Trinity, that Jesus Christ came to redeem us by atoning for our sins and the like of that. So, suppose it's true that from the limited perspective of methodological naturalism, the best way to think about human beings is evolutionary psychology and conflicts with Christian belief. That's perfectly compatible with Christian beliefs being true. If you start from only part of the totality of what you know, you may very well come up with some beliefs, some propositions might very well be probable with respect to that are in conflict with other things you know. So the Christian should say here, right, from the point of view of that limited scientific evidence base constrained by methodological naturalism, these evolutionary psychological theories are correct. That's right, but it doesn't follow, of course, that they are correct with respect to my entire evidential base, and I say they aren't. Okay, that's the conflict and the superficial conflict, as I say, between Christianity and science. What about what I said was the deep concord? Well, I'm running out of time, so I can't tell you. I'll just refer you to Bill Craig. Bill Craig already explained what some of this deep concord is. The Christianity with the claim that we human beings have been created in God's image and created in such a way, therefore, that we can know things about the world, makes a very nice home for science, and science, of course, grew up in the bosom of Christian theism. Now, turning to naturalism, first of all, the superficial concord. Richard Dawkins, as I quoted last night, says in a certain place that evolution makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, because it gives a kind of answer to the question, how did all this plant and animal life get here? Where did it come from? It gives an answer to that question that prior to, say, Darwin, wasn't available to the naturalist. So there is a kind of superficial concord. There is deep conflict, though, and that was the lecture I gave last night. So I really can't, I've got right now about 35 seconds. I can't compress the whole lecture that took more than 35 minutes last night into 35 seconds, but the basic point is, if you accept naturalism and you also accept evolution, then the probability of your cognitive faculties being reliable will be low. In particular, the probability that the cognitive faculty that produces belief in naturalism, that that's reliable, will be low, all right? Once you see that that probability is low, then you have a defeater for the proposition that your cognitive faculties are reliable. That is to say, you have a reason for rejecting that proposition, that they're reliable. Once you have a defeater for that proposition, that your cognitive faculties are reliable, you have a defeater for any proposition that's produced by your cognitive faculties, including the conjunction of naturalism with evolution. So that conjunction produces a defeater for itself. It is therefore self-defeating. That means you can't sensibly believe the conjunction of naturalism with evolution. That means that naturalism conflicts with evolution. But evolution is an important, widely accepted, paradigmatic, contemporary scientific theory. Therefore, naturalism conflicts with science.
Okay, I think the main issue that both Al Plantinga brought up and William Craig brought up is that to deduce atheism from science, you need to add the supplementary premises of methodological naturalism or metaphysical naturalism. And I don't think that's true, because my original argument I gave, all the deductions I gave were deductions from scientific theses, and there were no metaphysical or naturalistic assumptions in the argument that were not in Einstein's theory itself. And I think that pertains also to what Al Plantinga is saying. He wants to say that you need methodological naturalism in order to have a scientific theory such as evolutionary psychology that is inconsistent with Christian belief. But I don't think that's true, because I think the abandonment of God and Christian belief from science actually grew out of science itself, because science began roughly around the time of Newton's book on natural philosophy, and Newton included God within his science, and that wasn't a methodological supernaturalism or a metaphysical supernaturalism. That was actually an axiom within his scientific theory. Newton claimed that space and time were God's sensorium. And Copernicus claimed that he defined gravity non-quantitatively, but he defined it as as the means by which God brings about the falling of bodies to the earth. But as the time went on, as the 19th century occurred, using the method of science, not methodological naturalism, but just using science, the predictions of science and the evidence gathered from that, it was found that there's no evidence that space and time are God's sensorium. So that was dropped from Newton's philosophy. And all references to religion were dropped from science because there was no evidence for that. No religion could make a prediction that could result in a confirmed observational evidence. And I think with regard to Darwin's argument, I would say that I didn't hear the talk from last night, apparently, but I would say the argument that naturalism and evolution is highly improbable. Well, first of all, I would say that naturalism is itself entailed by Darwinian evolution, since it's actually a part of evolutionary theory. And so you can't conjoin evolution with naturalism and treat it as a logically independent conjunct. And if you try and conjoin evolution with theism, you get a self-contradictory proposition, because evolution includes naturalism within itself, because evolution describes a natural causal process that brings about the evolution of organisms. And it brings about warranted belief in humans, because the purpose of life, according to Darwin, is to survive and reproduce, and you can survive if you can make your way about the world. You only can make your way about the world if you have true and warranted beliefs about what the world is and where you can find food and things like that. And so it's natural evolution itself that explains why you have warranted beliefs. And as for evolutionary psychology, that is not an established science. That's still regarded as a speculative science that is not fully academically respectable. One reason is that its conclusions all just happen to support the political right-wing beliefs. And for a science to be true, serious science, its conclusions have to impress themselves upon anybody, regardless of their political beliefs. But I think a more serious science today is genetic psychology, which establishes the genetic inheritance of certain personality traits, in particular such as religion and atheism. They've done studies published in September issue of Science, 1997, showing that atheistic temperament and religious temperament are genetically inherited traits. And they showed that by taking identical twins, bringing some up with atheistic parents and some with religious parents. And they found out that the twins brought up with atheistic parents, as adults, the twins were both, they brought the twins up with atheistic parents, one twin with atheistic parents, one twin with religious parents, but both of the twins ended up as adults being atheists.
Okay, we need to wrap it up.
Okay, one more sentence. And then they took another set of twins, and they brought them up with atheistic parents and again with religious parents, and both these twins, when they grew up to be adults, had a religious temperament. They believed in God. So that would tend to show that whether you're an atheist or a theist is a matter of the genes that you inherit from your parents.
Is science opposed to theistic religion? A theistic religion being one that conceives of God as an absolutely perfect being who is personally involved with his creation. In the past, there have been sharp clashes between the historical claims made by fundamentalist theisms and some of the historical sciences, such as archaeology and cosmology. But sophisticated contemporary versions of theism have succeeded in neutralizing these conflicts by sharply separating the sorts of facts that science, in principle, is capable of explaining, and those that are fair game for theism. There are, however, other ways in which science can oppose religion than by negating some of its creedal doctrines. It could put a strain on, create a liability for theism without being logically incompatible with it. It will be argued that it does this by giving some support to a metaphysical system that is at odds with that of theism. It must be emphasized that this oppositional relation is an indirect one. It does not hold between science per se and religion, but instead between religion on the one hand and a metaphysical theory that is rendered somewhat plausible by science on the other. Science, according to this scheme, need not render theism improbable, less likely to be true than not. Rather, it lowers the prior probability that theism is true, in which the prior probability of theism is the probability that it has relative to our background knowledge minus science. First, the metaphysics of theism will be sketched, and then the opposing metaphysics that science renders somewhat plausible. According to theism, God's purpose in creating the world was to have it populated by creatures like us, who can, through their own free endeavoring, come to know of his existence, adore, worship, and obey him, and eventually enter into a loving communal relation with him. This requires a metaphysics that depicts the world as a fit habitat to such creatures, one in which objective status is accorded to those sensory, emotional, aesthetic, and evaluative characteristics that give meaning and purpose to our lives. This is a humanistic or anthropomorphic metaphysics that projects the categories that apply to the world of human endeavoring onto reality at large. The world is designed so that it will serve as a proper moral proving ground for their free struggles to achieve sanctification and ultimately salvation. The world, therefore, becomes fraught with human meaning. Because human beings are made in God's image, they are essentially spiritual beings, as is their Creator. It is their immaterial souls that survive the medical demise of their physical, organic body. Their souls enjoy a libertarian type of freedom, similar to God's, that makes each of them a mini uncaused causer, an instigator of a causal chain without being determined by any earlier events to do so. This cozy, comforting metaphysics has been challenged ever since the rise of the new physics in the 16th century. The remarkable success of modern science has led many to question the three basic tenets of this theistic metaphysics. First, the objectivity of what has human significance. Second, immaterial souls. And third, their libertarian freedom of the will. The underlying tenet of their scientistic metaphysics is that science tells us of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. Since each of these three tenets of theistic metaphysics finds no place in the scientific take on the world, they are false. Let us consider how this is supposed to happen for each of these three tenets. First, the bifurcationism issue. The new physics was supposed to have shown that only the so-called primary qualities, those that are needed for the formulation of scientific laws and theories, have objective reality. All the rest, such as the sensory, emotional, evaluative, and aesthetic qualities, are relegated to the dung heap of the subjective, being nothing but ways in which organisms like us are consciously appeared to. Our common sense view of the world is radically mistaken. A troubling bifurcation between man and nature is thereby created. And much of philosophy since the 16th century, even when not theistic in intent, is an attempt to heal this breach. Surprisingly, some of the leading proponents of a scientifically based bifurcationism were themselves believing theists, most notably Descartes. Descartes was worried by the false beliefs that were based on the manifest common sense view of nature, since false belief is taken to be a species of evil. He developed a free will theodicy for false beliefs that had the buck of blame stop with creatures for not properly exercising their free will so as to acquire true beliefs. In other words, ordinary persons are remiss for not having tried hard enough to master contemporary physics. But this free will theodicy leaves untouched the far more serious problem of why a personal God would want to create a world that was denuded of everything that gave it human meaning. Why in God's name would he want to create a world like that? Second, physicalism. The spirit, if not the letter, of modern science looks askance at the ontological dualism between mind and matter. Given the dramatic success that science has had in explaining a wide range of phenomena in terms of the laws and theories of natural science, it is reasonable to inductively infer that the universe is a closed physical system in which all events are so explainable. Furthermore, the triumphant progress of neurophysiology in explaining human behavior in terms of physical processes going on within the organism, as well as its natural environment, make it not unreasonable to inductively infer that all human behavior is so explainable. The sort of mind-body causal interactionism required by theism not only violates conservation laws, such as that of angular momentum, it is objectionable on intuitive grounds, for mental and physical events are not, on purely conceptual grounds, properly suited to have causal relations with each other. If a mental event, for example, were to cause a physical one, the time-honored intuition that there must be as much reality in the cause as in the effect would be violated. The same problem arises for the theistic doctrine of God's timelessly bringing about worldly effects in time. Third, determinism. The successes of the natural sciences make it dubious that we possess the sort of contra-causal freedom of the will that is required by theism's libertarianism. Without such freedom, theism is immobilized in dealing with the challenge posed by evil. For the only sort of defenses and theodicies that have any plausibility require libertarian-type free will. The success of the social sciences in giving naturalistic causal explanations of religious beliefs and experiences, although not showing that they are respectively false or unveridical, challenge exclusivist theistic religion, such a religion being one whose creed entails that every other religion contains at least one false proposition in its creed, and that salvation can be achieved only by following this religion. Given how culturally determined religious belief and experience are, it is implausible that any given exclusivist religion is true, which does not mean that no generic brand theism is true, one based on a kind of vital common denominator of the creeds of the great extant religions. The theist, of course, will challenge all three of these scientistic views. It's not science, it's a metaphysical theory inspired by science. For example, bifurcationism can be avoided by denying either scientific realism, as would an instrumental account of scientific theories, or the assumption that what science does not take note of is not. Physicalism could be challenged either on conceptual grounds or from the perspective of paranormal psychology. The point is that theists must commit themselves to highly mooted and dubitable metaphysical theses. And this creates a liability for theism, one that is probability lowering, though it may not lower it
Time to finish up.
to less than 1/2.
I think my friend Richard Gale's main point here is not that these things he proposes are in fact false, with these implications of theism, but that they comprise a certain cost. So if you're a theist, if you're a Christian theist, you're sticking your neck out in a certain way. You know, you're saying something which in some sense could be false, so you're taking a certain risk. That's quite true. Also true for naturalism, or in fact for any philosophical proposition, or in fact for any proposition of any kind, except possibly, say, mathematical propositions, where ones which are sort of totally and utterly obvious. Otherwise, if you say anything significant, you are sticking your neck out. The particular costs he proposes, though, here, don't seem to me to amount to much. For example, here's one cost. Here is one cost. The underlying tenet of this scientific metaphysics is that science tells us of what there is, that it is, and of what is not, that it is not. Since each of these three tenets of theistic metaphysics finds no place in the scientific take on the world, they are false. So the cost here, one cost is that the theist has to reject the idea that any proposition which doesn't find a place in the scientific take on the world is false. The theist has to reject that. That's quite right. But that view, that proposition is eminently rejectable anyway. In fact, I think that proposition is necessarily false, and the cost of rejecting a necessarily false proposition is pretty minimal. In fact, I'd say it's completely minimal. No cost at all to rejecting something that's necessarily false. Why do I think it's necessarily false? Well, it says if something doesn't find a place in the scientific take on the world, then it's false. Theism doesn't find a place in the scientific take on the world, so theism is false. Science doesn't say theism is true, so it's false. But similarly, atheism isn't part of science. Science doesn't say atheism is true, so atheism would have to be false too on this principle. Both theism and atheism would have to be false. And that's a contradiction. That would be to say that theism is true because atheism is false, but also false. Theism would have to be both true and false, and atheism would have to be both true and false if that principle were true. And that's a bit too much to put up with. A principle like that, I would say, is necessarily false, and so the cost of rejecting it is minimal. Next, there is bifurcationism, which is the thought that all the rest, that is, only the so-called primary qualities, those that are needed for the formulation of scientific laws and theories, only they have objective reality. All the rest, such as sensory, emotional, evaluative, and aesthetic qualities, are relegated to the dung heap of the subjective, being nothing but the ways in which organisms like us are consciously appeared to. That's another thing, then, that the theist has to reject. But again, it seems to me that's eminently rejectable. There's very little cost in rejecting the idea that only primary qualities have any reality, so that, for example, there isn't anything real about morality. I say there is something real about morality, and I think we all think so. I mean, I think that's the natural human thing to think. For example, I believe it's not right for me to lie about my colleagues in order to advance my career. And I suspect most of you would agree with me. That's not the right sort of thing to do. I don't think for a moment that science shows that it's not true that that's not right. Science doesn't speak on that topic at all, and quite properly so. So I don't see that there is any cost here coming from science in saying that there is more to the world than these primary qualities. Next, physicalism. Here the thought is, he says, the spirit, if not the letter, of modern science looks askance at the ontological dualism between mind and matter. So physicalism, so science, he says, rejects what I was arguing for this afternoon, namely psychophysical, rejects dualism. That is, the idea that human beings are not themselves material objects, but rather are souls, let's say, or minds or selves that have material bodies. Well, 2 points here. First, it isn't part of Christianity. It's not an implication of Christianity to say that human beings are immaterial objects. As I said this afternoon, there are Christian philosophers, my colleague Peter Van Inwagen being an example, whom I mentioned this afternoon, who are themselves materialists about human beings, think that human beings are in fact material objects. So it's not really a cost of Christianity. But second, if it were, it would be one that I, again, would be very happy to pay, because it seems to me the idea that human beings are just material objects, that's false, and I think demonstrably false. Because as I was arguing this afternoon, I think one can see that it's not the case that a merely material object could be about something or could think about something. So again, the cost here is minimal. In general, I would say the cost associated with naturalism is much higher than the cost associated with Christian theism. And so while I agree with Richard that there are some costs connected with being a theist, with being a Christian theist, you do stick your neck out in doing so, I would say the particular costs he proposes do not amount to much.
At this time, for about the next 20 minutes, the panelists will have a discussion amongst ourselves. There are quite a number of topics we could discuss. Certainly, Professor Gale, would you like to begin?
I'd like to examine Al's argument that given just naturalism and evolution, it's very improbable that our cognitive faculties are reliable. I think it's highly probable that they are, because they have worked successfully in helping us to survive and survive well. It's like tools. If you can use a hammer successfully on your physical environment, that tells you something about the nature of that physical environment. Furthermore, I think on Alvin Plantinga's Aquinas-Calvinist model, the Reformed epistemology model, it's highly improbable that our cognitive faculties are reliable. The reason being, according to this story, because of original sin, our cognitive faculties, our sensus divinitatis, for example, was seriously impaired. And that's why there's so much false belief and why so many people fail to know of God's existence. And it takes a special supernatural intervention by the Holy Spirit to repair this damage. So given that story, I think it's highly improbable that our cognitive faculties are functioning properly and therefore are reliable. So I'm sort of turning your argument on its head.
Well, that's not very nice of you, really, but but I would. Shall I reply to what Richard says? Well, there are two parts to what he says. The first part was that if, as a matter of fact, our cognitive faculties have enabled us to survive and reproduce, then probably they are reliable. Well, I talked about that at some length last night, but on the face of it, that's not at all obvious, because false beliefs can be perfectly adaptive. So, for example, if there is this tribe that thinks everything is a witch and can only form beliefs of the sort, that which has property P, that which is so-and-so, if they think that, all of their beliefs will be false. But if they ascribe the right properties to the right witches, so that they ascribe to lion witches the property of being fearsome and being such that you should run away when you see one, their body parts will be in the right place for survival. Those beliefs, though false, will be perfectly adaptive. For any true belief that's adaptive, I think you can also come up with a false belief that's adaptive. And this is to suppose something that's not given here at all, that as a matter of fact, on evolution and naturalism, N&E, together with materialism, which goes with those two, the content of a belief enters into the causal chain that leads to behavior. But I won't say any more about that. The other thing, he says, given the Christian story, it's unlikely that our cognitive faculties are reliable because of the damage, the noetic damage due to sin, the noetic consequences of sin, or the damage done to our cognitive faculties by sin. But Christians have always thought about this as concentrated with respect to knowledge of God, and perhaps also knowledge of one's own inner condition. So that it's not, no Christians have suggested that as a result of that, people don't know where they live or how old they are or how to get from one place to another or how to walk or anything like that. Not at all, just with respect to knowledge of God and what God requires of us and what God wants from us. So the thought would then be, Richard's thought would be that human cognitive faculties in general aren't reliable on that point, but that's no problem from the Christian perspective. The Christian perspective is that there is that sort of damage, but it is progressively done away with, progressively restored by virtue of sanctification, by virtue of the Christian life and walking in the Christian life as a result of conversion.
There is a rebuttal to part of what Professor Plantinga has just said. A consilience argument would go like this. Supposing it is possible on an evolutionary account that our beliefs could be radically mistaken in part and still lead to adaptive behavior, still it seems unlikely that our beliefs could be radically mistaken across the board and still lead to adaptive behavior. So that by simply taking any one example, it doesn't make larger point of the argument.
Yeah, but Keith, I just gave you an example of a tribe, all of whose beliefs were false. Their beliefs are all systematically false because they all entail that there are witches, and there aren't any. Those beliefs are nonetheless all adaptive. So you can have whole systems of belief that are adaptive but false.
That changes the nature of the argument, though, as to whether or not evolution would likely produce systems of behavior based on entirely false beliefs. And
yeah, I mean,
that would be a new argument. I'm not saying it's an argument that couldn't be made, but it would be a new argument.
Well, I thought it was the same one. It was the one I was proposing. But if
we
it's
might,
new, so much the better.
We might.
I've got a question for, I've got several questions for Quentin, really. One thing Quentin says is something like this, that no religious statement, no proposition about God could be empirically verified. That seems to me to be whoppingly false. Here's a counterexample. God has not created 700-pound rabbits in Cleveland. One can certainly verify that. You go to Cleveland, and if you don't find any 700-pound rabbits, you know God hasn't created any 700-pound rabbits in Cleveland. I've got another question for Quentin, too. I've got another question for Quentin. Quentin says that according to science, according to the general theory of relativity, each state of the universe is explained completely by the preceding state of the universe. But Quentin knows perfectly well that according to the ordinary classical orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, when there is a collapse of the wave function, when there's a measurement, let's say, well, then there is the wave function collapses in a certain way, and there isn't any physical explanation of its collapsing in that way. So I don't see how you could say that, Quentin.
Oh, because the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics doesn't apply to the universe as a whole.
Doesn't what?
It doesn't apply to the universe as a whole, but only to a localized subsystem within the universe, and therefore it can't apply to states of the universe as a whole.
Well, I mean, so you've got as part of the whole state of the universe this collapse. That particular part is not explained, so the whole thing isn't explained. There's a part of it that's not explained. You were saying that to explain all the parts is to explain the whole, and to explain the whole is to explain all the parts. Here you've got a part that's not explained.
Okay, well, I think I'll respond to that by saying that most physicists who are on the cutting edge of developing quantum mechanics, they all reject the Copenhagen interpretation. And the two predominant interpretations they accept, the consistent histories interpretation and the Bohmian interpretation, they all are deterministic theories.
Yeah, but I don't agree with you that most physicists reject, you say on the cutting edge. So
On
maybe,
the cutting edge.
Maybe you're defining cutting edge as ones that reject the Copenhagen theory.
No, by cutting edge, I mean ones who publish articles in Physical Review D about how to help advance the interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Well,
and I say the ones who aren't on the
there is
cutting
at
edge
least
merely teach quantum mechanics but don't write anything about it.
At this point, I exercise my prerogative. And there are any number of cutting-edge interpretations of quantum mechanics. One of them is called the many worlds interpretation. Philosopher John Leslie says that this is an alternative to fine-tuning arguments for the existence of God. I wonder if Professor Craig or anyone else would like to comment on that.
Actually, I think John Leslie sees many worlds hypotheses as being very friendly to the idea of fine-tuning, because those who have the resort to many worlds in order to explain these anthropic coincidences thereby show that there is something here that cries out for explanation, and that the easy answer, oh, this is just due to chance, it's just the cosmic lottery, doesn't satisfy. So that in that sense, although the many worlds interpretation is an alternative to design, it does nevertheless recognize that there's something here that cries out for explanation. There's more than meets the eye. And so in that sense, it's a kind of backhanded compliment to the design theorist. And they find themselves in the same bed with each other. Now, one would want to go on to try to criticize, I think, these many worlds hypotheses as an illegitimate attempt to multiply your probabilistic resources without warrant. It's like trying to explain some improbable event by saying, well, there were many rolls of the dice and there are many worlds. And I think one can criticize that on a number of grounds.
I agree that the many worlds hypothesis has nothing to be said in its favor. However, I disagree with your initial remarks that even if it were true, it would not in any way undercut the argument that you gave from the fine-tuning. I think it completely undercuts it, because if you have the many worlds, then there will be among them some worlds that have the kind of fine-tuning that will bring about our evolution. We just happen to live in one of those worlds. And it's like whoever wins the lottery, it's highly improbable that they would win. And yet we know someone's got to win it. And likewise with the many worlds. We know that there's going to be some world that'll have the right fine-tuning for the evolution of us.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that it wasn't an alternative to design. You're quite right, Richard, about that. But what I was suggesting is that even though it is an alternative to design, that both the design theorist and the many worlds theorist recognize that there's something here that cries out for explanation, and they offer metaphysically different.
But the many worlds theory gives that thing that cries out for explanation, why we're here, in terms of, well, according to probability theory,
they
some
are
world
alternatives.
is going to have it, and we just happen to be in such a world, and there's no reason to explain anything further.
Right.
So it puts an end to the regress of why questions.
Well,
that's the way the cookie crumbles.
I mean, that's the goal.
You know,
I think that one of the difficulties with these theories is that there aren't any mechanisms to generate many worlds that would be random and varied, and those mechanisms that have been suggested often involve fine-tuning themselves, so that it's like a lump in the carpet that's depressed at one point only to pop up somewhere else. But you're quite right, I think, in your basic thrust, that it does represent an attempt to avoid design.
So the push is for an explanation as opposed to a brute fact, and we have alternatives, but the claim both here is that many worlds is not a very satisfactory alternative.
Could I ask a question of Richard? Because I think that the point that you were making connects with what Al was saying, in that it doesn't seem that it's so much science itself that is incompatible with religious faith. It's this scientistic metaphysic
Right.
that seems to have accompanied, maybe late 19th century science and then on into the 20th century. And it's really this sort of, it's more like a sort of sociology of science that maybe is inimical to religious belief rather than science itself. And I think in a sense Al was agreeing with that insofar as many scientists would want to say they have to presuppose methodological naturalism to do their work. And it seems to me that there is a point to be made here on your side, that there is this sort of sociology of science that is unsympathetic to Christian faith. But I guess what I would want to call into question is that whole methodological naturalism and say that this is an unjustified scientism, it's based on philosophical assumptions we need to drop.
Agreed.
Okay. We're running out of time. Do you have a quick?
Well, yeah, I'd like to comment on something Richard said a moment ago about the many worlds hypothesis. I don't think I entirely agree with that, which sometimes happens with me and Richard. But if you consider, say, our world, the likelihood that just by chance it would display this fine-tuning is much smaller than the likelihood that it would be so by design. That is, the proposition that it's fine-tuned in this way is much more likely on theism than it is on the chance hypothesis. Well, let's add lots of other worlds too. Let's say there are as many as you like. It's still true with respect to our world that the likelihood on its being designed of its being fine-tuned is much greater than the likelihood of its coming to be this way by chance. So I'm not sure that adding in all the other worlds really makes any difference. What it does make is this difference. You know that somewhere in that whole host of universes there will be some that are fine-tuned. Maybe you do know that. But it doesn't change anything with respect to our world.
Quickly.
You know, it's interesting about the many worlds hypothesis. Many theists would be very upset if David Lewis were right and there were an infinite number of concrete worlds just like ours. So every way that a world could be is a way some world actually is. And why? Maybe it's because we cease to be important. It's far worse than what Copernicus did in decentering man. Well, consider another way that science might create a liability for theism. It's discovered, or has good evidence, that there are countless solar systems like ours with planets similar to us, so probably there's life similar to us throughout the universe. Milne, the cosmologist, raised the problem, does this mean that the coming of Christ and his crucifixion become a traveling tent show, playing one-night stands?
You know, it's sort of interesting, Richard.
That's an interesting issue. So here's a way in which modern cosmology might create a problem.
It is an interesting issue, but it was already broached in the 17th century. And there were several divines in the 17th century that thought about this very question. They asked, well, might it not be that there's all sorts of other intelligent life throughout the universe? And they thought, yes, that could very well be. It'd be quite likely that God wouldn't just create us. I mean, we're wonderful and all that, but he might very well want to create all sorts of hosts of races of intelligent creatures. And then they raised that various question. Well, then what about Christ's sacrifice? And of course, one possibility is that these other races didn't fall. And another possibility, so they don't require any divine atonement. Another possibility is that they fell, but for them there was some other kind of atonement. And still another one is that Christ's sacrifice would be perfectly good for them too.
Weren't all these philosophers, or at least one of these philosophers burnt at the stake?
Sorry?
Bruno?
What was that?
Was one of the philosophers who suggested this theory you're recounting?
No, they were both eminent Anglican clergymen.
And they
wrote
weren't
books
burned?
on it. No, they weren't.
This is later than 1600.
Oh, okay.
No, they weren't. They weren't.
And
They
on
weren't
that-
even singed.
And on that point, but what Professor Plantinga does leave out, though, that there have been prominent scientists and theologians who have thought that the incarnation must be a one-time only event, and therefore extraterrestrial life is impossible. One named Maunder, for example, was prominent in the debate over the canals on Mars. But we're out of time on that particular debate.